Good morning to each and everyone who is joining us this morning at this webinar. I welcome you on behalf of Minds as the chair of the Board of Trustees. My name is Graça Michelle. I would like to recognize each and every one of you who really made the time to participate either as speakers or as attendants, but to participate in this webinar, which we consider to be an important building block of our common understanding of the meaning and also the importance of the Africa Trade Agreement. I would like to start by acknowledging the presence of the Minister of Trade and Industry of South Africa, Minister Patel, Dr. Abdu Mukhtar from the ADB, who is our second keynote speaker, and Dr. Ife Ogo from the UNDP, and Mr. Moore, who is a former Minister of Public Works in Liberia. And of course, I acknowledge our own founder, Dr. Nkosana Moyo, who is going to be leading our discussions this morning. To all other participants, which I cannot name because I do not have access to all of you, and it will take us also a lot of time, please feel welcome, and we value your presence and your participation today. Before I pass the floor to our founder, I just would like to make a very short reflection of where we are and looking to our recent past as Africans, and take lessons from the way we internalized and we implemented the long and hard journey of our political freedom. There is no one single country on the continent which did not participate in the liberation of Africa. But if I can use the example of the last bastion of colonialism and apartheid, which was Southern Africa, I'll focus on that because it was the last. It was a kind of mobilization and ownership of the sense of freedom for all. Freedom was in interest of each one of the countries. So it gave a deep meaning to the concept of solidarity. Solidarity was not only to express sympathy, but it was to take a stake, to own the sacrifices which were required for us all to achieve freedom. Freedom of one country or two was not enough. All countries had to free themselves from colonialism and from apartheid. Just to give a very short example, when Tanzania and Zambia became independent, they didn't wait until they could build their economies to open their doors and invite the liberation movements to take Tanzania and Zambia as their home and as the space from which they could launch all what it takes to free themselves. From that point on, the freedom of Mozambique, of Angola, of Zimbabwe, of South Africa and Namibia, it became part and parcel of the Zambian and Tanzanian people. First, it was Mozambique and Angola to become free. And they also immediately, they didn't wait until they could even consolidate their institutions as state, but they also opened their doors to free Zimbabwe, and much later then to embrace all of us around the frontline states, for those who can remember, for us to liberate Namibia, and finally, to launch the last onslaught on apartheid in South Africa. But having the whole of the continent backing the struggle, literally in every country would go, the clarity of how we free ourselves from colonialism, from apartheid was there. And we made, all of us, the sacrifices which were required for that to happen. So very quickly, I just would like to ask some questions. We are in 2021. What is it, what we define as freedom for all Africans? Freedom for all. And how do we all take a stake in what it is necessary for us to achieve through the regional integration and through what is the tool at our hands now, which is Africa Trade Agreement. Every period in history has its own challenges and its own tools, but it is important for us to use, the references of the past whenever they can be useful to give more clarity of the how we should all participate, all take a stake. How do we give the meaning of solidarity in the struggle for economic development and freedom of all of us from poverty, from underdevelopment, for all the economic and social ills which we all know? I thought it would be important just to refer to this so that more than just talking of the Africa Trade Agreement as a tool, but we understand and we accept that it's a freedom for each and every one of our countries. It means to take a stake. It is in the interest of all to share what is necessary for us to, as ultimate goal, to be free as Africans. So without more further ado, can I pass now the floor to Dr. Moyo, who is going to lead our discussions during our work this morning. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Mrs. Machel, for kicking off the process and getting us on the road, so to speak. And may I add my welcome to our panelists and acknowledge especially, and I hope that the other panelists will understand, that Minister Patel has made time in his very busy schedule to be with us. And similarly, that Dr. Mukhtar is decided to take time away from his leave, in fact, to be with us. We appreciate that very much. So very briefly then, without wasting too much time, because it's important that we really get into the substance rather than anything I might have to say, because it's not going to be much to add to what the chair has said already. I'm glad that Mrs. Machel has started us off by referring to the liberation struggle, because I think we all need to understand that the liberation struggle was the first phase of our continent liberating itself. That was not by any means the end. The second and most important phase is that of economic liberation. And I think we can all agree we're kind of struggling with it. And it's not surprising we are struggling. It's not an easy task to achieve. So today we're going to focus on what it will take and where we are and what it will take to put in place an infrastructural system that will serve the purpose of underpinning the implementation of the AfCFTA. Because although the concept of the AfCFTA is brilliant, its implementation will require really heavy lifting of a practical nature, done strategically, done in phases, and maybe very importantly, implemented in a manner that avoids the concept of beggar thy neighbor. We need to go back to revert to understanding how to configure the solidarity that we need so that we avoid tripping over and disadvantaging members of the community through what we do in our own countries by making it more difficult for the neighbor to achieve real participation on a beneficial basis. Having said that, I think I should move straight away because our Minister Patel is on a very tight program and he's apologized up front that he will not be able to stay after his address to us, but nevertheless, that's going to be very valuable for us to get an insight from somebody who sits in a place of policy formulation, which will be critical in the implementation, like I say, of the AfCFTA concept. So Minister Patel, without really wasting any time, we can read your very rich bio. So we'll do that in our own time. I think everybody knows who you are and that you are a very busy man. So let me hand over straight to you so that you can share as much time as you have with us and tell us what is going on in this space and what your thinking is and how you guide from your perspective what we should be doing to develop the necessary infrastructure, as I say, in a very strategic way, accepting that we will probably going to have to accept the discipline of phasing what we do because we can't do everything in one go. Over to you, Minister Patel.
Well, thank you. Thank you very much, Dr. Moyo. And I'd like to greet Madame Michelle and the other participants who are here today, as well as the panelists. And thank you for inviting me to be part of the discussions. It is my regret and my loss that I will not be able to stay for the rest of the discussion. And the topic that I understand we are dealing with today is Africa's preparedness for the largest free trade zone in the world. And this webinar looks at that through an infrastructure lens. I'd like to make 2 framing remarks and then 5 comments on the topic for the webinar. My first framing remark, colleagues, is about Africa's place in the world. Consider these statistics. Africa is home to 17% of the world's population, 17%. It accounts for 3% of global output. And it accounts for 1% of global steel production. Steel often being a proxy for core industrial capabilities. In those 3 numbers, we've summarized the challenge that we face. African integration, economic integration, among others through the African Continental Free Trade Area, if well implemented, can transform Africa's fortunes and bring the efforts of liberation movements and the vision that underpinned the struggle against colonialism to fruition. Can we shake off the legacy of the past, not by asking for foreign aid, but by taking our destiny into our hands? History is not destiny. So that for me really situates and contextualizes my remarks. The second framing comment is to say that an infrastructure lens is a necessary and vital element of looking at African regional integration. But it has to be combined with at least two other elements, and it's these acting in consort with each other that can give us the outcomes we need. First, of course, is trade policy that helps Africa to enable greater trade between ourselves, and that's where the African Continental Free Trade Area that was supported by 54 countries, ratified by 37, and is now in the process of implementation modalities, is so vital. But connected to that is industrial policy, is a set of actions in our different countries and in combination with each other that enables the free trade area to stimulate investment in industrial output. The old saying that Africa consumes what it does not produce, and it produces that which it does not consume, that saying can be turned into history if we seize this moment. And Africa is blessed with enormous natural wealth, with huge natural resources. Those resources are largely exported to continents elsewhere in the world to be turned into products using the combination of human ingenuity and human skills. They create jobs elsewhere. Africa has an opportunity to change that storyline. And the third one is infrastructure, because simply having the legal framework to enable trade and having the production output will not support the growing opportunities that there are unless we at the same time have the means to move those goods from one country to another, to have integrated value chains. I'd like to turn then, Dr. Moyo, to a few brief comments on the infrastructure part itself. The first is that, of course, effective trade rests on strong infrastructure. So we need to do things to boost Africa's infrastructure platforms. Without that, we are not going to be able to unlock all of the opportunity that there is nascent in the free trade area. What kind of infrastructure? We need both hard infrastructure, things you can visibly see with the eyes and touch with the hands, and soft infrastructure, the systems that enable integrated trade. There are a few obvious areas of infrastructure development that is critical. Transport and logistics is important, so it's roads and rail and port and air links between our countries. When I recently wanted to travel to another African country, it would take me significantly longer than to travel even as far as China. And that is one of the challenges that we will have to grasp in the trade dimension. But it's also border posts, systems that are slow, that are misaligned between sending and receiving countries. 2 meters or 10 meters may separate these posts, but it's as if the administrative systems belong in completely different worlds. We need to also enable greater rail integration. A number of years ago, I showed a map in the South African cabinet of all the rail lines on the African continent. And it was a telling picture, because visually on that screen, we had rail lines like spider legs moving from some arbitrary point in the continent to the nearest port. That arbitrary point happens to be the source of raw materials. There was very little connection between countries as the core of that rail network. And so changing those kind of things are critical. Briefly, because of time, there are energy challenges, and it's one area where regional energy pools would need to be developed that enable surpluses of energies in one area to be utilized as an input into industrial activities in another area. ICT, particularly broadband connection, the undersea cables and the overland cables are absolutely key to enable, in the 21st century, Africa to unlock the opportunities of digitization. Water resources, both as a generator of energy, but also as a key input into irrigation systems, is vital. In South Africa, for example, the heartland of our economy, which is the Gauteng province, relies on water that is pumped from Lesotho upstream, if you like, against the forces of gravity to enable the development of Gauteng. But while I have covered what are seen to be the big four, which are transport, energy, ICT, and water, I don't want to underplay two other bits of infrastructure. Education and skills infrastructure, because economic development requires a steady flow of skills. And that too, we need to think of as African initiatives, not only national initiatives. And then financial infrastructure. Moving goods across borders require payment systems that are aligned, that enables money to flow from importer to exporter. And there are complexities that we would have to carefully navigate in enabling the speeding up of greater trade and greater industrial development. The second area, so having spoken a little bit about the what of infrastructure, I want to deal with the cost issues and the financing issues. In just about any measure of Africa's infrastructure gap, it's enormous. The Brookings Institute, for example, estimates that the infrastructure investment that is required would be somewhere between $130 billion a year and $170 billion a year. That's a very significant sum of money. And the gap in that funding, in other words, that missing bit that we have not been able to raise in our infrastructure programs is about $100 billion. Now, $100 billion, not once off, but on an annual basis to be invested in upgrading, strengthening, and in many cases, just building basic and advanced infrastructure that can enable trade is what is required. Clearly, there is an important role here for the private sector. We need to be able to attract private capital to support and boost our efforts. And while the private sector will play a key role, effective infrastructure rollout and development across the world requires strong capabilities in the public sector too. So it means public finance will have to have a more significant investment component, that even without challenged budgets, we're going to need to put more of the national budget aside for investment in infrastructure, even as we encourage and lock in private sector investment. And so these have profound implications for national budgets. The actual build program requires much to be done. Specifications, what the engineers do is the easy bit. The more challenging one is the economic feasibility, to build a strong business case, something that shows that the return, either the return directly to a project or the return to a national or regional economy, justifies the investment, because Africa does not have the resource envelope for white elephants. It needs to be able to build a productive infrastructure that will be able to more than pay for itself over a period of time. And then there's the physical build, which provides huge opportunities for African infrastructure companies to be developed and to grow in this period. Very briefly, my third remark would be that we have existing infrastructure which, with systems changes, can take much greater volume of goods and enable more things to be done. And then we have the opportunity and the need for new infrastructure. So in thinking through infrastructure, it's not just the build program, vital as that is, it's also better use of what we have. And so border post upgrading, for example, would be something that can be done quite quickly, aligning systems which does not require cement and bricks and so on is as important as the cement and brick that may flow. And there is a growing level of trade between African countries, and so we can sweat those assets more, even as we build new assets, because we will need to build new assets. My fourth remark is about the opportunities and threats. And there are many, but I want to single out only a few in these brief remarks. Let me start, because it's always good to start with the positive, with the opportunities. And the opportunities are vast. The opportunity is there for us to build industrial capacity as we build infrastructure. The supply of steel and cement and bricks and components and machinery could either be satisfied by massive imports from elsewhere in the world, or we can take a decision that those critical industrial inputs into the infrastructure program is the opportunity to build Africa's industrial base. Because the fundamental deficit that our continent faces is a deficit of industrialization. Now that requires careful design of the infrastructure rollout program. It means ensuring that global institutions, the IFIs, as well as any other funding that we mobilize, is sensitive to the need to build African industrial capability. It's not going to be an easy task. We will receive advice to say that these should be processes that are fully competitive and open to everybody in the world. But unless Africa industrializes, the world will always have to see our continent as a recipient of aid. We want to change that story. It's in the interest of the global community to change that story, that there's an assertive, strong, dynamic, industrialized Africa. And that does mean that the infrastructure program must stimulate that industrialization. There's an opportunity then, as I indicated earlier, for major African construction companies to develop. There'll be some specialization and division of labor, some that build core competencies in the development of power plants, others in water supply, yet others in rail and so on. And so there's opportunity for different parts of the continent to be able to galvanize the entrepreneurial energy of Africans, to tap into our capital markets and to mobilize the savings of our people to be able to drive this. And we also have the opportunity to build governance capacity. Infrastructure requires quite sustained governance from the moment of the development of the concept right through to execution. And that is something that provides an opportunity for us to modernize our systems of government. South Africa, for example, we've learned a very, very detailed and sometimes painful and expensive lessons about infrastructure development over the last 2 decades. And we now need to take those lessons and bring them into our new infrastructure rollout and share that with neighbors and learn from what other neighboring countries have learned, mistakes others have made. We each can benefit from by adjusting and learning. There are threats. The threats are fundamentally around corruption. That infrastructure investment across the world is often associated with corruption because so much of infrastructure is triggered by decisions of administrators, of governors, of public servants. And that provides a huge temptation and a huge incentive. And when that happens, an enormous additional cost is added to the infrastructure program. And that means there's less infrastructure we can build. And corruption also has the pernicious effect that very often projects that are substandard are approved because payments are made improperly. So to be able to build the kind of high quality infrastructure that our economies and our citizens need, we need to accompany this with a very strong anti-corruption focus, learning from best practice and building that actively into our programs. And the other threat around infrastructure is weak administrative systems that will be able to get one part of our build program sorted, but not the other, because following construction, there is the operation and maintenance of infrastructure. And that is often as critical and sometimes more so. We did a study in South Africa looking at our infrastructure base, and we took it through a maintenance lens, not a new build lens, but a maintenance lens, to be able to see how costly non-maintenance of infrastructure is. Money saved in the short term is huge additional cost in the medium to long term, shortens the period in which an economic asset can be used. And most importantly, it degrades the ability to use that asset even in the medium term. And so we've got in our administrative systems to be thinking through full life cycle of infrastructure, not only the part around the building of new infrastructure, but the operation of that infrastructure and the maintenance of it. That means universities, colleges and others have to generate the skills that's required across the continent to be able to take these infrastructure challenges on board, that we use Africans to be able to run all of our key infrastructure, because this too will provide an opportunity, if you like, an alternative to the brain drain where we lose some of our finest minds to other continents, but we must provide that opportunity. And my final comment is around a symbiotic relationship. And that symbiotic relationship is between private investment in industrial and commercial activities, in mining, in new factories, in large malls, and in agriculture. That the more we stimulate private investment in our economies, the more we create demand for infrastructure. Or to put it differently, we build the business case of why people must build or strengthen or expand a railway line, because you now have investment flooding in building these things. And in the past, we put an infrastructure story out there to say, if only we build, then we will attract. We need to be able to attract investment right now and say to those who are going to finance the build, we are building because we are attracting investment. And the reverse also holds. The more there is infrastructure. In fact, I'm struck by the fact that when I speak to foreign investors, one of the most important questions they ask, much of our discussion really focuses on infrastructure. They want to know about energy security in the long term. They want to know how do they move their goods from one place of production in South Africa to another place in our own country, in the rest of the continent, and elsewhere in the world. So there is that symbiotic relationship that we need to be mindful of, and we can strongly build and develop the case around that. So Dr. Moyo, thank you for the opportunity. I've really just touched on the surface of some of the deeper issues that's required, but it requires going forward strong coordination across those three fronts: infrastructure development, the focus of today; trade opening, which is the focus of the discussions in the Council of Trade Ministers and the heads of state; and finally, industrial development, which is the area that we need to put much more emphasis and much more focus on. Thank you very much for this opportunity to make a few remarks. Dr. Moyo, you just need to unmute yourself.
Thank you. Yes, I was saying thank you very much indeed for making the time. You've started us off so richly by giving us a scan of the issues surrounding this issue. We've done it so well, and all the different key components of what we need to be thinking about, and the opportunities and the threats and so on. But I love mostly the fact that you indicate that if we are smart in the configuration of this, we don't have to go through a phase where it's only cost involved, but actually we use the infrastructure build out to drive some industrialization and supply the resources required to do the outbuild. It's just such a very smart way to think about it, so that you don't sort of perceive a load first without seeing how it stimulates actually where you are headed to, the industrialization element. Very beautifully spelled out. Thank you, sir. And we'll be reaching out to you some more. I've already been in touch with your office incidentally, and we'll try to build a relationship which allows us to partner as we think through what needs to be done. Thank you very much indeed. Much appreciated.
Thank you very much. Thank you for those very warm comments.
So if we may, the minister, I'm sure, is going to find a way of disappearing as we continue. We'll proceed straight away and go to Dr. Mukhtar to take us through his presentation, please.
Thank you, Dr. Moyo. Thank you, everyone. I want to start by thanking Her Excellency Mrs. Mashal and you, founder of Minds, for really inviting me and giving us an opportunity to participate in this very important dialogue. Thank you very much. So I just have 20 minutes to speak, and I know that time is running, so I have shared my screen. What I think I will do today is really, as the Honorable Minister Patel has done also, is to make a case, because we're talking about infrastructure here, but it's not infrastructure really just for infrastructure's sake to feel good about it, even though good infrastructure makes us feel good, but also just, what is the rationale, So I think the topics today talking about regional integration, industrialization and so on. So I just want to make a case for why these are important, and then talk on the role of infrastructure in bringing about that, and then talk about what needs to happen. And then coming from the point of view of the African Development Bank, of course, talk about the role that DFIs and AfDB in particular is doing, and maybe a list of some projects that we're doing in support of this great initiative. And then I will see whether I will be able to, at the very end, answer the question, which is the question of the day, which is Africa really prepared in terms of infrastructure to take advantage of the free continental trade area? Now, infrastructure has always been an issue. As the minister has said, we have always been looking at it across countries, across the continent, in the African Development Bank as a very important and urgent issue. But there is a new context, the elephant in the room now, with COVID. You've seen what COVID has done. The devastating impact of COVID, we have actually been set back in terms of economic development on the continent. Africa, for the first time in 25 years, went into recession in 2020. Trade went down by almost 10%, according to the WTO. Manufacturing output, again, also by about 10%. According to McKinsey, industry revenue by more than 25% on time. So, can you hear me, Dr. Moyo?
Yes, now I can. Yes, I can.
Am I frozen? Okay, just want to make sure. Yeah. So basically saying, yeah, there is a new context in the whole mix right now. So what I'm saying is issues around economic transformation, economic development in Africa are even more urgent now, because now we have even a bigger crisis, something that has already added to the problems that we already had in the past. Now, there is a general consensus around, some of the key issues around economic transformation on the continent. At the very top is what we call the high five. So in the African Development Bank, we have these 5 priority areas for economic development: energy, which is Power Africa; feeding Africa, which is agriculture; industrialization, integration of Africa; and then improving the quality of lives. But the reason why I put that slide is just to show us there's an alignment between that and what also the United Nations Sustainable Development Goals. So the UNDP has done a study that showed that if Africa can only just focus on the high fives for the African Development Bank, would be in line to achieve at least 90% of the SDGs by 2030, which is really a huge important. But more importantly, is that there's alignment between the high fives, the SDGs, and also Africa's Union Agenda 2063. So really, it's not that there is consensus around what are the key things, what needs to happen around the continent. So let me talk about fragmentation. And I know that Her Excellency, Ms. Marshall, talk about, colonialism and so on. But, some of the things, one of the major problems really is that of fragmentation. What you see here, the next 4 slides, I'm just talking to you about how Africa has just been fragmented at every level. So geographically, this slide that I'm showing you just like so many, 54 countries. The average distance between major cities, almost 4,100. Average flight time between major cities across the continent is 12 hours. Yesterday, I spent almost 7 hours at the airport just to fly from Abuja in Nigeria to Kano, which is, an hour flight, but it took me almost 7 hours just because of the flight issues around the country, and it's the same across the continent. But if you compare that to many other continents, you see that, it's not as much. So Africa is in a worse shape, geographically speaking. Now, geopolitically, we are also fragmented. And if you look at it, just the number of countries, you need about 24 African countries, to make up like $1 trillion of GDP. 43 countries on the continent will have to come together to just give rise to a $1 trillion GDP. Compare this to many of the other continents, as you can see below the African continent. In terms of logistics, this is even more worrisome. Africa is logistically fragmented. This really, you see all these axes in red on the map of Africa on the left. This is showing like all the non-operational other rail lines, roads between countries that are supposed to be operational just to bring the continent together, to bring the countries together, but many of them are non-operational. You see many of the axes. Because of this logistic fragmentation, intra-regional trade cost in the continent is almost 320% compared to much less in many of these countries. And we know that the volume of intra-Africa trade, many African countries prefer to trade with external parties and trade within Africa just because of this logistic challenge and the fragmentation. More worrisome is the trade side of things. We have right now at least 16 trade zones in the continent. You see some of all these acronyms. I don't even know what many of them mean. You need an average African will need visas to travel to 80% of African countries. Compare this to Europe. They have only 4 trade zones, North America only 1 trade zone. So the Africa Continental Free Trade Area that came into effect in January 2021, it will be a game changer, absolute game changer, because what it will do is it will not necessarily dismantle all these trade zones and these trade, communities and so on, but at least it will aggregate them into a bigger market, at least. So on the industrialization front, I think the minister has said that, but what we've done in the bank is we look at, industrial output, manufacturing growth over the last 20 years from 2000. Just look at it compared to other emerging market economies. Africa, and by Africa here, we took a sample of about 10 African countries, across the different regions. Those are listed below in the graph. But you can see that it's really below. Look at China, way up there. Vietnam, Bangladesh, India, they're all doing that. And this is like a 20-year cycle. So 5.1% compound annual growth rate for Africa. Compare that to Vietnam, a small country, almost 10%. So there's a lot of issues around integration and industrialization, but there is good news happening. So I'm not only here to state the bad news, but indeed, I'm bold to say that African integration is actually happening in a number of ways. This figure is actually a little dated to 2016, but if you look at it in terms of FDI, FDI specifically here referring to Africans investing in other African countries, because that's really important. Africa trading with Africa partners, so in terms of goods, in terms of mergers and acquisitions, African companies acquiring other companies on the continent, or Africans traveling to other African countries for tourism and for other things. There is an upward trend across the board. And we believe that the AfCFTA will actually further accelerate this. On the industrialization front, we want to say that solid industrialization is currently emerging. And what we're seeing is clustering of particular industries around particular countries. You look at South Africa, for example, consumer goods, mining, services, aggregating in that place. Nigeria, of course, petrochemicals, building materials, cement, and so on and so forth. In Morocco, you have the aeronautics industry, chemicals industry, and so on. In Kenya, you have telecoms, you have services, ICT, iron and steel. So we're seeing a creation of those industrial clusters coming together in different countries. So the key message here is with the CFTA, so the opportunity for the CFTA is that, if you're able to create this, you have with this big market, so you don't need to create many of these industries in all these other countries, so you cannot have 54 African countries, each one of them trying to do the same sector or the same product. It doesn't make sense. So that's where the issue of comparative advantage for each of these countries, where they have the best skills and what they can do to add value, because now they have this bigger market that they can do. So this clustering is really, really important. What we've also noticed is the emergence of what we call the African regional champions. So we've done a study to say, look, sometimes it's important for small and medium enterprises to drive economic growth, and this is the story across the world. But it's also important to have linkages to big companies. Those have the capital, they have the manpower, they have the capacity and the capabilities to link with those SMEs to support economic growth. And I think that is really one of the things that will emerge out of the CFTA down the road. So we've identified about 75 African companies. These are indigenous African companies that we call regional champions. And our definition of regional champions are companies that really operate in at least 10 African countries. And you see in almost major countries, you have them. South Africa has the most. But we also included 75 multinational companies. These are also foreign companies, but they have like strong local presence, and that are also, of course, operating across different countries. In terms of the industrialization agenda, from the way we look at it in the African Development Bank, we basically say, look, what are the things that need to happen for Africa to industrialize? What are the key challenges and what are the key things that need to happen? And we developed what we call flagship programs around each of these. The goal of this slide is really just to show you that infrastructure is really key. You can see that this second flagship program here, we call it Catalyze Funding into Infrastructure and Industry Projects. So really, we've identified infrastructure as one of the key things that need to happen for industrialization to happen and also for integration to happen. Now, to summarize this part of the presentation, this is the house, industrialization house, we call it in the bank. Really, the ultimate goal, of course, in industrialization, as the Honorable Minister Patel has said, in his closing remarks. But many things have to happen, So you have to prepare the grounds, political power, willpower, the governance, stability that needs to happen, the foundation. But you also have the pillars. You have to have the building enablers. You have to. So that's where you can again boldly. Infrastructure is on the top of that list. To industrialize, you have to have the basic infrastructure. The human capital has to be there. The business environment has to be right. You also have to look at the rules. So this is where regulations, standards, policies, to promote the sector will come in, and then engagement, of course. The private sector participation, public sector, and investment promotion. So, in terms of industrialization in the African Development Bank, the way we look at it, we look at all the sectors that really need to happen for economic development in terms of the maximum impact that we see. And this impact, of course, will come around issues around how many jobs can be created, what is the revenue creation potential, the impact on trade balance, and also just basic linkage to the markets across the continent and the opportunities that the CFTA will provide. You can see, so we're working now with what we call 15 addressable sectors that are shown here. You can see that the top tier sectors, which is where really we put a lot of effort. These things change as we move on. For example, the pharmaceutical sector, which is actually used to be in tier 2, now because of COVID and the need to develop capacity around vaccine production, pharmaceutical production, we've actually upgraded it to tier 1. But you see that ICT, transport and logistics, building materials, many of the sectors that are, again, Minister Patel has mentioned, but these are really the critical sectors, infrastructure-related sectors that need to happen for industrialization. And we're putting a lot of effort in that in the bank, and we're looking to support governments and companies as they do that. So to start winding down, to the main topic. So role of infrastructure, in creating this single market. We've also, Minister Patel had mentioned, the weakest instrument, the AfDB, we've also estimated 130 to 170 billion gap in infrastructure by annum, and this, like everything, is already listed here in terms of energy, transport, communications, internal water systems, but also the financial systems that need to happen, the payment and settlement systems, logistics, trade facilitation, and so on. So I'm not going to waste too much time on this because I think the minister has already mentioned many of this. But what now going forward, just taking each of these sectors one by one. So energy and power, absolutely critical. The gap is huge. There is no 640 million Africans, at least. That's almost just about 1 quarter of Africans have no access to energy. The whole of the African continent produces about the same power on the continent as the country of Spain. That tiny European country, West European country, that is not tenable, and we know the direct link, of course, between the energy that you need to create, to produce. When you look at some of those African champions that I mentioned, when we talk to them, point out, many of the things that why they're successful is really that they have found a solution around their power. So in essence, they actually don't rely on the national grids of the various countries in order to operate. They basically have to, generate their own power. But just look at it, how many of those champions and how many businesses can actually generate their own power. So they will still have to rely on the national grids for those countries. And the gap is huge. The estimated growth rate is at least 5% per annum, going forward. So this is really, really important. When it comes to transportation and communications, of course, when we talk about market integration, and you cannot integrate markets, really without having the necessary roads and logistics support. A typical example that I would like to quote it's cheaper actually to transport, a container from China to the port of Mombasa than to move that same container from Mombasa port to Nairobi, just in country in Kenya. And this is really not unique to Kenya. It happens in all countries. It's cheaper and I've worked in a company that imported a lot of some of the inputs from Taiwan and from China. It was actually cheaper to move those goods from China and Taiwan to the port of Lagos in Nigeria than to move the same goods, the same volume of goods from Lagos port to Abuja or to the northern part of Nigeria, just inland, because the road systems, the rail systems are not in existence. So this is really, really critical, and I think that is important. It's estimated KPMG has done a study and showed that business transportation costs in Africa is at least 50 to 175%, depending on which country, higher than other regions in the world. And you can see how this will absolutely impede cross-border trade, movement of goods, and add to cost of doing business for everybody. In terms of logistics, again, some of the things that the minister said, some of the cross-border activities and just building corridors across countries to reduce cost. Almost 1/3 of the landlocked countries in the world are in Africa. I think in Africa we have about 22 landlocked countries. So you can just imagine no access to ports, so they rely on ports maybe in other countries to move goods, and just the cost of moving those goods is really prohibitive. And so many of these things need to be unveiled and to do that. So to the last part of my presentation, I have a few minutes. What role will DFIs play in providing private infrastructure? So look, nobody can do infrastructure alone, and I think the minister is very clear on that. You need the public, you need the private, but you also need development finance institutions, and many of us, the Africa Development Bank, and many similar institutions are doing that. Out of the almost 270 infrastructure projects in which the private sector participated in the last 10 years in Africa, about 64% had some participation by a multilateral or bilateral DFI. And we come in various ways, right? We can make sure that projects are well structured, because infrastructure projects by definition are very complex. They are high cost, so we make sure that they're well structured. We provide long tenor debt and to support this, because you cannot borrow billions of dollars and pay at within a few years. We also make strategic equity investments In the bank, for example, we created 2 institutions that really are also just focusing on infrastructure. We created what we call AfCFTA, which was set up by the bank, AfDB, just to focus on infrastructure, because we feel that even though we do infrastructure directly, but we need a more focused actor to continue to do that. The Africa Finance Corporation also, in which we are a major shareholder, does a lot of infrastructure. So we provided equity through those kind of institutions directly to that. But more importantly, and I had an interesting discussion with Dr. Kosona, maybe you'll talk about this, but when you want to bring in private sector players to this, you have to identify the kind of risks that they're taking and find ways to mitigate that at least they can deploy their own capital and know that they at least have some guarantee in terms of how much they can potentially lose if things go awry. We also come in to provide political risk cover, because we of course work with governments. Many of them, all the African governments, are our shareholders, so we have that unique in the AfDB opportunity to influence policy. Quickly running through, we've spent, now this is really just what the AfDB is doing, because I think it's important to zero in on that. We spent in the last 10 years about $5 billion in private sector support to infrastructure, maybe about 3 times more direct support to governments. You can see the breakdown by sector, again, the critical sectors: transport, power, ICT, water. This is the breakdown by year. We are on the upward trend. In 2019, it was about $5.4 billion US dollars. As many of you know, in the bank, we doubled our capital from $98 billion to almost $200 billion last year. And what this means is that we can do more, bigger projects, more impactful projects, and infrastructure, of course, is at the key of what we'll continue to do and where we'll continue to do that. The various instruments I've mentioned them before, so provide debt, either senior debt, subordinated debt, equity, but also all the guarantees and instruments and products. And we're really very flexible, because to be honest, one of the roles that we play is catalytic. So we want to crowd in investors. So if an investor you want to come in, one of the key questions we say, even if we're not providing financing, direct financing to that infrastructure project, we'll be able to work with investors to create products to minimize risk, to mitigate the risk that they may be taking. One area where we are increasingly getting active is the PPP area, because we feel that PPP is really one of the key areas where infrastructure spending can be deployed, and we've developed a PPP framework in the bank to help strengthen the framework and institutional capacity in countries, because it's very, very important. You need to have that connection between the countries and the financiers, but also to prepare the projects, which sometimes take time, all the feasibility studies that need to happen to make sure everything will go all right in terms of the financial models, in terms of the risks that have been taken, also issues around the environment and social issues that need to be addressed upfront before you begin to do some of these projects. And of course, the issue of financing. This, I'm not going to spend too much time, is some of the examples of key transactions that we've done. And you can see everything from airports to airlines to ports to bridges and roads. But more importantly, I think that the key is really regional infrastructure. So while we support infrastructure inside countries, but increasingly, especially because of the AfCFTA and in our effort to support the implementation of the AfCFTA, we're looking more for regional connections, so infrastructure, roads, not necessarily roads within countries, but roads that move across multiple countries, airports, airlines that move across regions, because again, the goal is to integrate and to industrialize. So these are some of the things where we play a part. We provided the grant for the takeoff of the AfCFTA Secretariat in Accra to help with the negotiations, but also to help with building capacity, hiring staff, the basics that need to happen for the administration to take to come into effect. We spent in the last 5 years about $12 billion in infrastructure, and mostly we focus on, again, in regional infrastructure. But we're also doing trade finance deals because, again, trade finance is really critical for traders and for manufacturers and so on. So we spent also about $4 billion in the last 2-3 years. So finally, example of some of the roads we're doing, really these are critical roads, Abidjan to Lagos, corridor, you build those roads, basically, integrate those markets, but more importantly, you create economic activity along those corridors, trading activity, you formalize some of the trading that happens there, you simplify the borders, Angola, Zambia to Angola, the Lobito corridor, we've done the Kenya to and bypass, so just roads really linking countries and also regional rail, so rail systems will be, let's say, from Ghana, Accra to Cote d'Ivoire is something that we'll be looking at. So I will stop here. I think I'm just about exceeding my time with a few minutes. The answer to the question, whether is Africa prepared, my answer is really we have some way to go. I think that it's important that people have identified the infrastructure as a key minds for organizing this, because I think this is not a one-off dialogue. It will just be the beginning and the foundation of many discussions, but more importantly, of action that needs to happen across multiple stakeholders. Thank you very much for listening.
Dr. Mukhtar, thank you very much for, like I said before, taking time on your leave days to be with us, in spite of the challenges of connectivity. At the end, I don't know whether everybody else did. When we were summarizing, actually, as soon as you said, I'll end here, I couldn't hear any more of you until just now. But it looks like the system stood up to the test for most of your presentation, so we appreciate that. I'm not going to again do a summary. I believe that this presentation will be available for us to distribute to those who are interested. Am I correct? I think we've lost you. It's quite interesting that you did the whole presentation, but at the end, the connectivity is letting us down.
Yes, I've already sent it, and yes, you can you. Okay, so presentation will be available. Will be shared. Has already been shared.
That the connection will allow us for you to entertain questions from our audience, because I think that's the most important element as well. So in the meantime, let's just move on and ask Dr. Ife Ogo to please respond to the two presentations. Ife, please, the floor is yours.
Thank you very much, and it's been great to hear everything that has been said. I have some bandwidth problems as well, so I'm going to turn off my screen and just share my presentation, if that's okay.
That's fine.
Okay, so okay, so if you can see my screen, I'm not sure if it has come on.
Yeah, it has. We can see.
So we've talked a lot about, or we've talked going around the AfCFTA and infrastructure and what is required and the needs and all of that. But I would like to explore a little more how the AfCFTA now, in more tangible terms, is linking with infrastructure and how this happens in terms of the construct of it through the policy work and how we can expect to see things in the implementation stage based on what some of the member states are doing. So to do this, I'll take a step back and say, what is the AfCFTA? We've talked a lot about the AfCFTA, but we haven't really said what it is. So it's essentially saying that all of these lines we see on the continent, all of these, we have a lot of borders, we have over 100 of them, we have all sorts of barriers to trade, to the movement of people. The idea is that now we want to then find a way to link everything, to coalesce and create one big block. So this is what the AfCFTA is. So it's saying we're going to set new rules, clear rules that apply to all who sign up to this, and we all know what the rules are, we all know what the game is. So that's what the AfCFTA is. And then, we've touched on this, and then, why the AfCFTA? And the idea is that if you look at this map, the bulk of Africa's trade is low value. It's things that have not been processed, it's things that have not had any value put into them, and so they're not expensive on the market, and then they're subject to these volatile prices. globally. And so the idea is that if we begin to trade more in the AfCFTA, the things that you find in intra-Africa trade, there's a higher quotient of processed goods than trade with other parts of the world. So the idea is that intra-Africa trade and creating this big space creates a huge incentive for those who produce on the continent, because there is some demand for what they make on the continent. So this is what the AfCFTA is. And then again, just to look at what is in the AfCFTA. It's a protocol on trading goods. It's a protocol on trading services. We expect that, of course, when you trade with someone, you may not always agree with them. So there's a protocol on the settlement of problems and trade things that come up, right? So those three have been done. And now we expect that over the next few months, we will see that these more interesting areas for me in terms of investment and competition and IP and e-commerce, we'll also begin to see how the continent frames its rules in this area to say it's not just about the exchange of goods and services, but we also want to create a common framework for how we trade or how we invest and how we compete in this space. So again, just to highlight what the AfCFTA is. And so trying to move now onto the infrastructure part. So the AfCFTA itself is designed with infrastructure tools. So the first is the rules of origin. The idea is that we will understand what the passport is for an African product, what makes a product African. So that is one of the tools of the AfCFTA. Then there's also an online tariff portal, and the idea is that the member states, the negotiators, will be able to go and in a tech space, be able to say, this is what we're doing, this is what we're not doing, and there's a space created for this to happen. There's also an NTB, the non-tariff barriers reporting mechanism. The idea is that as Africa begins to trade with itself, there's an opportunity for the traders of the continent to actually report and say, this is what I encountered. I was trying to move goods from country A to country B, and here's what happened. And then there's actually an institutional framework to address some of these issues. I think one of the presentations spoke to payments. AfriEximbank is building the Pan-African payments settlement platform. The last we heard, it's operational in 6 countries, and we hope that it will be rolled out across board. The whole point of this is that Africans can trade without going to source for Forex and be able to exchange across the continent. And of course, you have the African Trade Observatory, which then says all of the trade data that you need, all of the the intelligence that you need will be in one place, accessible. So the point here to make is that, look, the AfCFTA itself is being designed with an infrastructure lens in mind. So it's not just going off to sign, say, oh, okay, now we have a free trade area. But even as it is being built, even as it's being rolled out, there's a sense that you need certain tools for this to happen. And so I'll also move on to trade and services. We've talked a lot about goods and infrastructure and roads and rail, and that is, we need all of those things. But if you look over the last 10, 15 years, you find that it is actually services sectors that have that drive growth across board. You find that it's ICT, you find as entertainment in some cases. It is some of these services, sometimes the intangible sectors that create the bulk of employment in some of the member states. You find that it's them that actually drive growth, and they make up a large part of GDP. So as we think about infrastructure, it's important to think as we think about roads and rails and air and flights and all that, to also think about the soft part, which, if we look at things, is actually driving what we see in terms of growth and employment on the continent. The AfCFTA accounts for this, and there's a protocol on trading services. 5 sectors have been prioritized, which is the first one, 1, 2, I think it is 7, 9, and 10. And the idea is that these are the 5 that have shown us the most potential, and these are the 5 that the member states have prioritized. So in thinking about infrastructure, it's also good to think about how to link these 5 priority ones with what's going on in terms of investment and all these other things we've talked about. And so now I'll just come to the end of my reflections in that, how is the AfCFTA itself being rolled out? So what we're seeing is that all the member states have what they call their plans to roll it out. And these things are the main components of these plans. So you have the framework that looks at the economy broadly, you look at the analysis of where the member state is, you look at what the risks are, you say, okay, what are we going to produce? What are we going to trade? And with whom? You also say, okay, what are the elements that may prevent a member state from trying to achieve its goals in the AfCFTA. You also look at financing, and I think this is where a lot of the work on infrastructure comes in. What are we going to build? Are we going to build new roads? Are we going to build rail? Who are we going to fund? We have to begin to fund some firms. And I believe at this time, there are about 40 of the member states that have started work on these plans. So some have done these plans, some are in the process of doing these plans. But I think that very soon we will begin to have a sense of what the African states have said. Here's our priorities as we need to invest into this space. Here's what we need hard, here's what is soft, and here's how to go forward. So this is one practical and tangible way of saying, here's how to build all of these things we need to actually roll the AfCFTA out. And on that note, I think that it's also good to link what each state is doing across board, because it doesn't make sense to build a road in one point when the person next door is going to build a road on another point. And one way to coordinate that is what we're seeing through the RECs, like with ECOWAS. They're also saying, what is our bloc going to do to implement the CFTA? So as the member states build out their own plans, the RECs also have these plans that link to what everyone else is doing. And that's a very tangible way, I think, to make sure that things are coherent and everybody is able to move towards the same goal. We're also seeing things like, PAPs for payments, NTBs. And I think there's also space to invest not only in the member states, but invest also in what the RECs are doing, to say that it's important that we invest in it, because you can't live on your own, it's a shared space. So you have to invest not only at the member state stage, but also when things happen across board. And to end, I would just say, look, the AfCFTA, while we have a lot of hope and we expect a lot out of it, at the end of the day is a trade deal. A lot will happen on I think a lot depends on what happens inside the member states. For example, a few days ago, we talked about health and how there's an opportunity to trade health in the AfCFTA. But if a member state is spending only 3% of its GDP on health, there might not be that much to trade, even though the opportunity is there to trade through the AfCFTA. So yes, while we have a trade deal and we have all of these very nice things, a lot is really dependent on what the member states themselves choose to do. So thank you very much, and I'll end here.
Thank you very much, Dr. Ify Ogo, for sharing those thoughts with us. And if I may just point out, again, I'm not going to try and summarize, but something that aligns with what other speakers have said. What you point out that clearly the building blocks, to use my words, are going to be what happens within a country, but you also point out, and I think very appropriately, that there needs to be a synchronization. In other words, an infrastructure build out in a country, within the country, if it's totally misaligned with what the neighbor is doing, then we're not going to create the connectivity that underlies or supports trade between the two countries. So those are the kind of details that, again, will come into play as we roll out this infrastructure, the thoughts that need to go into the coordination, and maybe that's where institutions like the ADB also will be very helpful, since they are shifting their emphasis in many ways from supporting in-country to supporting much more across-border or cross-border type infrastructure. So yeah, a few observations that I picked up, but without any attempt to summarize completely. So let's move on to our next, Mr. Moore, our next respondent, so to speak. If you want to pick on what you've heard so far and help us digest some of it and add your own thoughts, please feel free. The floor is yours.
Thank you, Dr. Moyo. And again, my gratitude to Minds and Mrs. Gracia and everyone else for the invitation to be here today. I think one of the benefits of coming the last is, everyone has already said what's there to be said. And I thought I would just, make a few comments based on what I've heard so far. I think both the minister and Mr. Mukhtar have basically laid out where the weaknesses are on the continent. And one of the places that I want to start is we talk about hard infrastructure, the roads, the rail, and how important those are. But I think the minister also mentioned the soft infrastructure. And one of the examples I've always used is The distance between Cape Town and Joburg is comparable to the distance between Joburg and Lusaka, give or take maybe 100 kilometers. But a truck driver from Cape Town to Johannesburg would take about 17 hours, and the same truck would take about 5 days getting to Lusaka. The problem isn't simply the physical infrastructure in terms of the roads, it's also the integration of systems, border crossings, and the ease of being able to transport goods across the continent is going to be really, really important for any integration process that we're trying to do. The problem we're facing in Africa at the moment is not simply that on every measure of infrastructure, Africa lags every region of the world, especially when it comes to power and transport infrastructure. It is that the financing of that infrastructure is actually struggling at the moment. So, for example, the planned infrastructure, and this is planned financing of infrastructure across the continent, is already 39% lower than the need. And just because infrastructure is planned, it doesn't necessarily mean it will happen. So that's the first problem. The second thing is we've actually seen a decline in the financing of African infrastructure by every sector that has previously financed African infrastructure. So we've seen a decline in multilateral lending for African infrastructure, and we are beginning to see a sort of loss of appetite in financing large infrastructure in Africa from China. And China, over the last 2 decades, has been a significant contributor to the financing of infrastructure on the continent. Where we see hopes of being able to grow financing for African infrastructure is actually the private sector. But the private sector is not going to put resources at risk in African infrastructure unless there's improvement in governance. So if we think about how to attract private capital into African infrastructure, it has to be a reflection in terms of the governance of the continent. So these statistics are sort of dated a bit. I think they're from like 2016, but it was at that point, only about 43% of the continent's road infrastructure was paved. And of all of the continent's road infrastructure that was paved, 30% of that was in South Africa alone. And so you can see the scale of the problem that is required. The benefits of a continental free trade area is that it would increase, it would expand the emergence of regional value chains and increase trade in intermediate goods. Since the nationality of a product is not going to matter insofar as it is produced within the continental free trade area. So if I'm doing manufacturing in Nigeria, I could import some of the intermediate parts from Uganda, and that would still qualify as African. And unless we built industrial capacity, there's simply no way to take advantage of this. In 2019, the Minister of Trade of Uganda was sort of complaining that the U.S. trade framework with Africa, AGOA, insists that for a product to qualify as African, it had to have 40% in African input. And she was complaining that the 40% was too high, that most countries in Africa could not meet the 40% threshold for a good of a product to be considered African. Well, if we intend to extract benefits from the continental free trade area, then we need to be able to increase that trade in intermediate goods, and that 40% has to come from local African production. But that's not going to happen if more than 500 million people, more than half of the continent's population, still lacks access to power. Adding value. Minister Patel spoke about production of steel as a marker of capability of a country. Well, steel production requires high use of electricity, and so power has to be cheap and affordable for us to be able to make steel. So if we're going to move up the value chain so that Zambia is not simply exporting copper, but Zambia is able to process and smelt that copper, so that South African chrome is actually processed on the continent, then we have to increase the availability of power. And being able to do that, again, requires the private sector. most of the utilities in Africa, for example, you're in South Africa, Eskom has underperformed, and it requires significant infusion of capital to be able to provide the amount of power that South Africa needs to be able to not just grow the South African economy, but simply export some of that power to SADC. So if one steps back and thinks, is Africa ready? Well, we're on our way there, but there are significant drawbacks in terms of what needs to be done. And so as we think about the infrastructure that is required for us to be able to take advantage of the emergence of regional value chains, then we have to rethink how we finance that infrastructure. One final thing that I would say is that because of COVID-19, there has been a reassessment of global value chains. Across Europe and across the United States, there are questions now about the wisdom of an Asia-centric production and global value chain. And there is a possibility that Africa could benefit from the restructuring of value chains and repositioning of value chains. It is really difficult, though, to imagine how Africa benefits from this if the infrastructure that allows this to occur doesn't happen. So my hope is that as we think through the Continental Free Trade Area and think about how we can structure this agreement so that we benefit from it, we think about the infrastructure that is required, the financing of the infrastructure that is required, think about the soft infrastructure, including regulatory and environment, the integration of border systems, and all of these things, that the quality of governance will be able to give confidence to the private sector to continue to invest in the kind of infrastructure we need. Again, thank you for the invitation, and a pleasure being with you this morning. Really early here in California, but it's a pleasure being with you today.
What time is it actually?
Let's see. It's 3:28 a.m. I've been up since 2 a.m.
Oh my goodness. Much appreciated. Really
No worries. My pleasure. My pleasure.
And again, if I may just pick out a couple of things I hear you stressing there, which I think are very valid. The fact that COVID, although it's thrown a wobble at the world and at Africa as a whole, but it also potentially creates an opportunity of reconfiguration of global value chains away from Asia to Africa, provided we on the continent do the necessary to make it a viable proposal. Secondly, I hear you stressing a lot the issue of risk management in terms of under the umbrella of governance. And I think it ties also with the ADB's emphasis or focus on risk management instruments, financial instruments to risk manage any capital deployment by the private sector in particular. So I think the elements are there. It's a question of us not being discouraged by the diagnosis of where we're starting from, provided we identify properly the pieces and also then identify a realistic sequencing and a feedback loop for using the build out, but also feeding into it to support industrialization in the same process. So I think this sounds to me, it's coming to me as, very, very feasible. This, we can pull it off. It's not going to be easy, but it is by no means impossible. On that note, thanks to all our panelists, and I'm sure everybody will join me in thanking everybody, starting with the minister and ending now with Mr. Moore. Let us move straight on to a question and answer session, because really the benefit should not be from my talking, but from the engagement with our attendees, what is top of mind in their minds, what they would like to ask, add, or get clarified. So can I hand over to you? I think it's Sarah who is helping us through this, yes?
Yes, Dr. Moyo. I believe we have a few hands within the participants. So Nonku will just give them the platform and unmute them. Nonku, are you there?
I'm here, Sarah.
Yes, could you please just unmute Rukogoza John Damascene, who has a question, I believe.
Can we please start with the Q&A box while they get ready to speak? Because some speakers haven't readied themselves yet. We have about 9 questions in there.
Okay. Dr. Moyo, are you willing to read out the questions or can I go ahead?
There is a question which unfortunately has been addressed to the very first one that I see from Mamvura, addressed to the minister or the panelists actually. So yeah, any of the panelists can pick this up. What is the current position of the phase 2 negotiations on IP, competition policy and investments? That's the first question. He's got 3 questions. Second one is, what are some of the initiatives that the Council of Ministers is undertaking to promote the objectives of the AfCFTA? And lastly, when can we expect protocols on trade in services, etc., or are they already in place? I think Dr. Ife Ogo actually dealt with this issue, but please, any of the panelists wants to take these questions, feel free to indicate which one you want to answer of those 3.
Hi, Dr. Moyo, I think I should be able to jump in here. So in terms of the first one, what is the current of the phase 2 negotiations? So the negotiation should be concluded by end of this year. The guidance to the member states from the policy institutions is to be done with these by end of the year. So hopefully by end of this year, we'll see that we have the protocols negotiated. To the second question, what are some of the initiatives that the ministers are undertaking? So in terms to answer that, I think I need to explain the current state of the AfCFTA. So the AfCFTA is a work in progress. So while some parts of it are done, some parts of it are still in progress, right? So when the protocols are done, then the member states go off and negotiate what they will agree to. So for example, on the protocol on trading goods, each state is going to say, here is my list of products that I'm going to make tariff-free now, and here are those I'm going to make tariff-free in the next 5 to 10 years. So the ministers essentially guide this process, but at the end of the day, the AfCFTA is something to be realized by the member states themselves, right? And then to the third one, yes, there is a protocol on trade and services, and the negotiations are ongoing for the member states to agree what will be provided to whom. And I also think that by the end of the year, we'll also see the new schedules, which indicate what the member states have agreed to amongst themselves. So thank you. I hope that makes sense.
Thanks very much, Ife. Then there is a question again addressed. It's almost a question, but also a comment in terms of the quality of education. I think this question is from an engineer, Daniel Kakenga, who says that universities are not teaching our engineers essentially the value addition beyond exporting raw materials, if we take resource mining in particular. But the minister is gone. But I mean, I think your observation is clear, and what you are suggesting is that therefore, if we're going to really implement value addition, we also need to align our education system so that those who are responsible for that have got the skills to deliver on that agenda. I think that would be a fair summary of what lies behind your question. That is what we need to do. Then TD, you got a question. Good morning, and thank you for the opportunity. My name is, I'm not going to mutilate your name. I'm just going to call you TD. I'm a freight and a logistics senior engineer in the Ministry of Infrastructure in Rwanda. In the journey towards Africa integration, Africa has been making an effort to putting up frameworks to achieve that goal, such as economic blocks, AEC, SADC, COMESA, etc. Through these ones, policy strategies and other legal frameworks, as well as infrastructure plans, such as railways, roads, maritime, etc., are put in place, but the problem remains the financial challenges for their implementation, mainly because of the differences in the economy of countries, and all of those remain a white elephant. Dr. Abdu and Guyet Dr. Ife, what could you advise to the African countries in regard to this? My understanding is that you are saying plans are put in place, but they are never implemented because of financial challenges. In summary, I think that's what that question is saying. So please, panelists, feel free to chime in on that answer, that any proposals you have.
So let me try to, I guess that that's one of the reasons why we're here, right? To explore some of these issues, begin to have those discussions. Implementation is always key now. There are a lot of financing options. So I think that what countries need to do is to look at their own situation, what they can afford, and what makes sense to them, and look at the best possible financial option. So you can get money, of course, from private sector. You can get money, from development finance institutions. And I talk about, in the case of AfDB, some of the various instruments that we have. So you can look at what makes sense based on, your finance situation. But there are also a number of ways, innovative solutions that countries can look at. So one of them, there's a lot of money, for example, in climate finance. That countries can tap into. This is really money that is going into infrastructure that is considered green. And I think this is becoming an increasing way to finance infrastructure. Countries can float, for example, infrastructure bonds for countries that can afford it. That's also one way to do it. I talked about PPPs, basically bringing the private sector, working with them, providing the right enabling environment for them to bring in their money. Some countries actually provide tax incentive schemes. Nigeria has done that to build some of the roads in country, where they provide, tax incentives to big corporates. And in turn ask them to provide, some basic infrastructure around roads. You can look at blended finance, which is where, you take money, from concessionary money, almost like at zero interest rate from institutions like us, and then merge it with, money maybe from private sector. So at the end of it, the cost of capital is not going to be as much. So there are various ways. So I really think that final message is the money is there. Each country will just have to look at its own situation, make sure that it understands what is right for them, and come up with a solution. And we are available in the AfDB, for example, and many other institutions to provide that kind of support and advice to countries. Thank you.
Thanks, Abdu. Mugisha, you asked a question about how to encourage youths in the industrial domain or industrial sector, I suppose, in order to sustain development during increasing something. And I think you missed a word, I'm not sure what. But I suppose, if anybody feels they've got a way of responding to the broader issue of encouraging young people to get involved across the board in economic activities on the African continent, please chime in and see what your thoughts are. How do we get the youth to get involved and encourage them and equip them, I suppose, to be participants in this process? Any thoughts?
Can I take a stab at that? Again, you cannot exclude the youth in African development. There are two, for us in the bank, there are two basic constituencies, youth and women. Whatever we do, whatever projects we finance, whatever operations we support, we always ask a question, how many young people are going to be positively impacted? How many women are going to be positively impacted in terms of jobs and whatever? African youth, I think about 60% currently of African population is actually youth. So we have to find ways to support them now. The young people are mostly involved in SMEs, starting new businesses and going into entrepreneurship. So one of the most fundamental things that need to happen is to create that overall enabling environment for entrepreneurs, for young entrepreneurs, for people to set up new businesses. Whatever it is, whether it's the right policies, whether it's the right kind of financing that needs to happen, and also to channel and build capacity in certain sectors. Young people are predominantly involved in the ICT sector, for example. So supporting the ICT sector across the continent in services. In many countries, you go to, they have industrial technology parks. You have young people developing applications, computer applications, and trying to do some of these things. You need to create, the enabling environment for that. Finally, again, this is an initiative of the African Development Bank. We are establishing what we call youth entrepreneurship investment banks. So this is one of the big things for the AfDB in the next 2 years. The president has announced it recently during our annual general meeting, which is really providing, establishing banks in African countries just to target young entrepreneurs, because often these young people, they don't have money, collateral to borrow money to set up businesses, so they are not really cannot take advantage of the existing financial systems and structures, the commercial banks, the DFIs, and so on. So specific financial institutions set up to support the young people of Africa. Those are what the young youth entrepreneurship investment banks are all about. And we're working with a number of organizations and donor agencies to structure this and to set it up within the next 6 months to a year. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Abdu. The next question is for you as well, from Samson Odiambo. What role does the ADB play in creating enabling environment to support the digital economy, e-commerce initiatives, and paperless trade?
So e-commerce, so we have in the bank the ICT strategy, which is really anchored around 5 pillars. One of them, of course, so there is a whole infrastructure, the ICT infrastructure. So build, the cables and the satellite systems and the towers and whatever. And then there is the one that is about services. So that's where e-commerce comes in. And then there's development of skills, education, and so on and so forth. So in terms of developing e-commerce and so on, we're working really hard to support, payment systems. And I talk about it as part of one, and the minister also talk about it as one of the things that need to happen. One of the slides that I showed, I showed that I think about 60%, 46% or so of South Africans actually shop online. So you need to create those systems, and we are working with institutions like AfCFTA, that is also very big in those areas around payment systems to create that, so that e-commerce can be enhanced. So there are a lot of programs and initiatives that we're doing to support private sector players that are in this business, but also to create and support markets across countries, so some of the stock exchanges, so that they can integrate across the continent and so on, and have unified payment systems that can work to foster e-commerce across borders. Thank you.
Okay, then a couple of questions from Chantal. How do you connect African readiness with foreign influence, in brackets, big countries? And secondly, how best, in terms of strategies, can we use to attract investors who can develop sustainable cross-border infrastructure?
So I can just quickly say something to that. I think part of what the AfCFTA is trying to do is to address that question in terms of Africa's place and leverage in negotiating with larger partners. As Dr. Mukhtar noted, the continent is comprised of a lot of small economies, and when these small economies deal with external actors, they're negotiating from a position of weakness because the economies are just way too small. But if we combine the 55 economies of the continent into a single market, at that point, that's a $3.5 trillion market. It may not be the biggest in the world, but it's significantly larger, and it increases the continent's position in these negotiations with others. I think this is why it is important that the AfCFTA actually goes into effect, because it lifts Africa, it allows us to negotiate as a single unit, and therefore increases our leverage as we deal with others. In terms of the kinds of partnerships that are useful, I think so for example, the Chinese have done really well with infrastructure. That's a partnership that we can continue to pursue. Whereas our European and American counterparts have done really well with capital investment, especially human capital development. So in terms of health, in terms of education, those are the places where they excel. I think if we find the partners who can help us to get to where we want to go, but that it occurs on our terms, I think that is what happens, instead of us following others and simply doing what others want us to do we are finding partners that help us to do what we want to do. And the way we achieve that is in community. And that's why the AfCFTA is such an important part of achieving that.
Thank you.
Sorry. Yes, and sorry, just to add to that, just to say that those who invest are not always foreign, in the sense that over the last few years, what we've begun to see is the emergence of funds led by Africans in Africa who pull resources from Africa, and we're beginning to see them get some scale. Now, while these may predominantly be in tech or in e-commerce or in services, it's also important to begin to think about how some of these African-led funds can now begin to invest in hardcore things like roads or bridges or storage points that work for trade. So that, the point here is that we also have to look internally and see, okay, so those who are able to get financing from people on the continent should also be able to invest on the things that work for the continent. Thank you.
I'm going to scan through some, rather than going question by question, I want to scan through and pick up some of the rather provocative questions, if I may put it that way. So Daniel Mwape has asked a question here. South African supermarkets sell chickens from Brazil. How do we bring goods from other African countries into South Africa and the rest of the continent through the AfCFTA, he meant to say, I think, to promote trade among ourselves? Anybody want to tackle that?
Sorry, can you repeat the question, Dr.
Yeah.
South
Africa supermarkets sell chickens from Brazil. How do we bring goods from other African countries into South Africa and the rest of the continent through the AfCFTA to promote trade amongst ourselves?
Look, I think that is what we're talking about, right? The challenges, and I think that if we're able to produce enough chicken and goods in South Africa, then naturally, we should be able to do that. If an importer imports from Brazil, it may come down to some of the challenges that we're talking about. Maybe it's cheaper or easier for those for that distributor or the shop to get from Brazil than to get from some part of Africa, because it's more difficult to transport and to move some of the goods. So I don't know the particular situation in this case, but I think really this is the essence of what we're trying to do, right? To make sure that we're able to do that. And what I would say to people who are producing those chickens or some of those products, now we don't even have just South Africa market, right? So if you produce in South Africa, with the CFTA, then you now have access to, the entire 1.3 billion people across the continent. And again, as we build the infrastructure and we make the trading easy and the movement of those goods across the continent, I think things should work out well. Yeah, that's what I can say. I cannot comment specifically on the issue of South Africa and what.
Daniel,
I can just add quickly to that. Dr. Moyo, is that one of the reasons why Brazil is producing chickens and able to supply South Africa and parts of Africa, and why other African countries can't, is because Brazil also has a very dominant agricultural sector. Brazil grows a lot of soybeans and maize, and for a poultry industry to be successful, it needs feed. So African countries that are not producing maize and soybeans at the same scale that Brazil are, those countries are not going to be able to produce poultry in a way to be able to compete with the Brazilians. So again, if we expand the agricultural industry in Africa, we will be able to expand the poultry industry in Africa.
Daniel, I want to add another dimension to your question in terms of how, in my opinion, the AfCFTA can be made to work. And in fact, I could argue that without us thinking that way, we are going to continue to be very challenged to discourage African countries from buying products from further afield, from China, for example, because on the basis of price alone, it will take a very long time before any African manufacturer can beat the Chinese on price alone. This is where we're going to need to be very imaginative by building an architecture that is called, this is not my invention, it's a word out there, skin in the game. And what I would like you to investigate or to research is how the Airbus product was developed by Europe by creating the concept of skin in the game within the European community to discourage airlines from continuing to buy Boeing and they start buying the Airbus instead, because they were benefiting through job creation in their own countries, supplying components to the manufacturer or for the manufacture of the Airbus. African countries have to begin to think that way. In other words, how do we literally create, through the industrialization process, the ability for each participant in that club, if I may call it that, to both buy and sell from each other, rather than some countries being tempted to think that this is an opportunity to just sell to the other African countries. Because if you only sell and you don't buy from each other or from those you are trying to sell to, they are going to turn around and say, you know what, there is no incentive for me to continue to buy from you. I might as well go and buy from China if you're not buying anything from myself, yeah? So the development of an architecture of being to have a value exchange, create capacity in each African country to specialize in something, which it can then sell to the other countries to create the ability or the financial muscle for it to then be able to export from those other countries. That architecture has got to be deliberate. We cannot leave it to happen on its own. We have to develop skin in the game architecture very deliberately in order to focus much more and incentivize African countries into buying and selling to each other within the continent. Can I hand back to you, Sarah, for you to take questions from people who put their hands up rather than people who put questions down, if there are any who are waiting to ask their questions.
Thank you for that, Dr. Moyo. So we have two questions. One from Rukogoza John. Can you speak, Rukogoza? Please unmute yourself and go ahead. Okay, I think we're having a delay.
Thank you. Actually, it was by error. I'm so sorry for that.
You can go ahead with your question, Mr. John.
Please. It was by error. Thank you.
Oh, we understand. No problem. So I believe we can move on to Mr. Gondo. Mr. Gondo, you can speak.
Thank you very much. Can you confirm that you can hear me?
We can hear you perfectly, Mr. Gondo.
Okay, thank you very much. My name is Michel Gondo. I'm from SADC Youth Forum, or Southern Africa Youth Forum. We are recently going to convene our third SADC Youth Forum, and the theme is on the blue and green economy. So my first question to the panelists, any of the panelists, is we are trying to come with strategies on how young people can benefit from untapped blue economy, our oceans, our seas, fisheries, among other things, but at the same time maintaining sustainable environment. To what extent can a AfCFTA help not only the young people, but the blue economy in general from their view? Then my next intervention is the issue of cross-border trading. Most of the young people, our young people in SADC, especially, they are surviving because of lack of employment in terms of cross-border trading. It might be formal or informal, but also the question is to what extent this AfCFTA is going to enhance, as according to the panelist view. My point of departure is the issue of aspect of peace and security, especially in Africa, not looking only at SADC. we have recent disturbing issues from Mozambique, Eswatini, South Africa, and the traditional violence in other countries like Zimbabwe. We have in East Africa, in North Africa. To what extent is that a hindrance to the achievement of this, joining to what Dr. Moyo said in terms that Africa needs to, to grow, it needs to compete. To what extent is this going to be a deterrent to achieve the laid out objectives and the policies at hand? Thank you very much.
Does anyone feel like tackling that one? Peace and security issues.
Hello, Dr. Moya. I'll jump in on the blue economy part. Yes, I think the blue economy is inseparable from the AfCFTA. If you look at the trade routes in the world, I think Africa accounts for only about 2% of global shipping. And we have all of these, routes through the countries. And we've talked about roads and rails and airports, but one way to actually boost intra-Africa trade is through the sea, through the blue economy. And we haven't really explored that. And that's one way of trying to get goods across from one point to the other point in a way that may be quicker than by road. And this is something that we certainly need to explore. In terms of the young people and blue economy, I'll give an example. We met a young girl who makes poultry feed, interestingly, out of seaweed in Namibia. And this is one way in which she counters sort of the lack of maize, but she's come up with this interesting way of drying seaweed and also now feeding that into the poultry value chain. So the point here is that yes, there are many ways in which the blue economy can create job opportunities, can create employment, and create trade opportunities for young people who choose to explore that space. Thank you.
Ify, I hear you, but I suppose the challenge, though, is that the example which was given about China to Mombasa and then Mombasa to Nairobi, in many ways you can replace the China to Mombasa leg with a leg which starts from an African port somewhere, because you still have to deal with the issue of inward distribution of the product that would have landed at a particular port. So it's correct that we need to be imaginative, but I think it's going to have to be an integration issue, i.e., how do you make the inland distribution equally efficient so that you don't have your ports clogged by goods that arrive but cannot be then taken inland more efficiently or as efficiently as they arrive using the sea routes?
And that is certainly the case. So we're beginning to see the growth of more container depots in countries. You're beginning to see, for example, in some countries where those who are around it take up some space on a lease by the port and move their goods across. So we're also beginning to see the linkages between sea and road and rail. Is it happening as fast as we want? Of course not. But there are some good examples across board wherein you're able to link sea and rail, wherein you're also able to link sea, storage and road and rail. And these examples are those, I think, if we begin to build upon, we have some hope, I think. There are already some sea routes on the continent, from West Africa to Central Africa, from Central Africa to other parts of Central Africa, from Central Africa to Southern Africa. So the thing is, what are they doing? How can they scale up? And how can you then link them with all of the other work that is going on with ports and road and rail? I think that's an interesting thing to explore.
Absolutely. Sarah, let me just read part of a question. Part of it is a comment and then question. I'll just take the question from an anonymous attendee. He says, given what COVID has done, COVID has kind of accelerated the uptake of the digital economy, use of digital means of communication, such as we're doing now. Previously, we would have spent a lot of money trying to convene a physical meeting somewhere. But now more and more, we've been forced by COVID to do these webinars and I think extract good value at actually very low cost. And the question is, what more should be done to bridge the gaps and to position Africa for an inclusive digital transformation, building on what COVID has forced us to do? What more should be done?
I can just tackle. I can just add a few thoughts to that. I think one of the first things that we need to do is, and this comes back again to the topic of this conversation about our investment in infrastructure, you would notice that Africa has some of the highest cost of data globally. And for the African economy to reap the benefits of digitization, the cost of data has to go down. And there was a study that one of my colleagues did here at the Atlantic Council in Washington, D.C. that showed that part of the growth of the Indian digital economy coincided with a significant reduction in the cost of data in India. And so we have gained some benefits by going online during COVID, but we could gain significantly more if we were to. So one of the countries, Malawi, I think, has the highest cost per gigabyte of data, but Malawi is one of the poorest countries in the world and could benefit significantly from the expansion of its digital economy. So I think what governments can do, what the private sector can do to drive down the cost of data will deeply, deeply enhance our benefits from the digitization.
Indeed, indeed. I suppose the part of this capable state issue, I mean, I could quote for you many, many examples of this sad situation where the African continent is paying much more, even just for telephony, compared with regions such as Europe. And partly because I think our regulators, you can phrase it in many different ways, but part of it is that some of them have got no capacity to really get on top of their responsibilities and understand how they need to go about it. And sometimes when they try to do it, they're doing it for the wrong reasons, as opposed to understanding that it's better to create lower cost and maybe more reach and more uptake of a particular resource, but also creating a competitive environment, inviting other investors who are willing to come in and not imposing exorbitant licensing requirements which stop some investment taking in, to create a competitive environment that will also drive the cost down for the consumer. So I think our regulators, in my opinion, have got a lot to answer in terms of how they're approaching this issue of regulation and not employing competent resources to manage that process, because it's a very important element to allow uptake of technology and also allow the creation of a competitive environment which then regulates cost much better than almost like legalized, i.e. regulated price controls. Use competition as much as you can to drive the costs into a market-controlled issue. Yeah, our regulators don't show a lot of skill in that area. Sarah, how much more time do we still have?
I believe time is up for now, but we still do have time for closing and the conclusion from you, Dr. Moyo. And we would kindly ask that the other participants who still have questions to please send it through to the Minds info session, and we will be sure to send it to the speakers to try to answer it so that we can share it along with the recordings and the presentations that were shared today.
Okay, in that case, then, I mean, my closing remarks are going to be, I'm not going to try to summarize the rich content of our conversation because I'm sure that I'll do it injustice. But let me confine my closing remarks to thanking our panelists, our presenters and panelists immensely for the sacrifices they've made, some in terms of giving up their free time or when they're on leave, others in terms of sleep, like out of California, staying up late in the early morning to join us in this very serious conversation, very important conversation. The presentations, as you've been told, will be shared because I think they are very rich in enabling all of us to get more comfortable, because there is no point debating the issue of the AfCFTA if we don't familiarize ourselves with what it is and how it's meant to operate. Any suggestions that we have can only have value if we familiarize ourselves with what is being proposed, what is in place already, what we think should be changed. Our suggestions then will have relevance in that light. But otherwise, Thank you very much, and we're going to continue to engage with you as we pursue a better understanding and maybe more information in terms of interventions of what we think would work better in the implementation of this, so that it sees the light of day and does not die a natural death as a good concept, which was, like many other initiatives, never implemented. Thank you very much for your attendance and participation, and thank you for our panelists.